Silent love, grief, and the legacy of truth. It started in the quiet hum of everyday life, not with fireworks or a dramatic twist of fate, but in a coffee shop that smelled like cinnamon and second chances. Back then, I never believed love would find me in such a mundane place, seated at a scuffed wooden table, sipping lukewarm espresso and trying to write something meaningful in my battered notebook. The rain was tapping against the foggy windows, the sky a blanket of gray, and I had just decided that nothing interesting ever happened in my life. That's when she walked in. Her umbrella was broken, her coat damp, but her eyes were clear, sharp, and distant, like she wasn't entirely here, like her mind was somewhere else entirely. She sat 2 tables away, ordered black coffee with 2 sugars, pulled out a paperback with the spine worn thin, and didn't look at me. But I noticed her. That's the thing about moments that change you. They never introduce themselves. They sneak in like a draft under the door, and by the time you realize they're there, they've already rearranged everything. I saw her again the next day, and then again the day after that. She always ordered the same drink, always read in silence, always left before finishing her cup. I convinced myself not to care, to mind my own pages, to not search for meaning where there was none. But people like me were cursed with curiosity and long silences. One day I left a note on her table when I was sure she wouldn't see me. It said, "What's the name of the book you're always trying to escape into?" I didn't sign it. The next day, she came back. And this time, she looked at me. Not just in passing. Not a polite nod of recognition. She looked, as though she had been waiting for me to ask. She didn't say a word, just slid the book toward me as she left. A silent answer. I read it that night, every page, every paragraph, hoping to understand what she was trying to tell me. The book was sad and beautiful and laced with quiet longing. I left another note the next day. The page 147 made me cry. The game went on like that for weeks. Notes passed between tables, books traded like secrets. Glances that lingered a second too long, we never spoke. That was our rule, unspoken but understood. And then she stopped coming, days passed, then weeks. The barista noticed too, asked if my silent girl was okay. I didn't know. I didn't even know her name. I felt foolish for missing someone I had never really known. And still, every morning, I waited. And then one Thursday, she came back, hair shorter, skin paler, a scar trailing her jaw like a misplaced comma. But her eyes were the same. I didn't ask where she'd been. I just slid a notebook across to her table with a pen inside. For the first time, she smiled. It was crooked and tired, but it was a start. She wrote in it, just one sentence, "Don't fall in love with me," and left it there, a warning dressed like a whisper. I didn't listen. I never was good at obeying signs. From that point on, we spoke. Not much, but enough to build a rhythm. She told me her name, Nora. She never asked mine. I don't think she wanted to know. Names made things real, and she liked to pretend we were just moments, just chapters, not a story. But to me, she was already a book I couldn't put down. We started meeting outside the coffee shop, a walk through the park, a visit to the used bookstore on 4th, a late-night phone call that neither of us admitted we needed. Her laughter was rare, but when it came, it cracked open the walls she'd built around herself. I learned how to read her silences. The way she touched her necklace when nervous, the way she bit her lip when trying not to cry. I memorized her like a poem. She was hesitant. I was persistent. She said she didn't believe in love. I said I didn't believe in giving up. There were days when she disappeared, hours she wouldn't answer her phone, nights she'd show up at my door with red, rimmed eyes and no explanation. I never pushed. I should have. One night, after watching the city lights blur through raindrops on the window, she said, "You're too good at seeing through me." I said, "Maybe you just need someone who refuses to look away." She kissed me for the first time that night. It was careful, desperate, as if she wanted to be anywhere but here and yet nowhere else. That kiss undid something in both of us. And maybe that was the start of the unraveling. I don't remember when it changed exactly. Maybe it was the day she stood me up without a word, or when she started answering my questions with half-truths. Maybe it was when I realized she was never fully present, that part of her was always holding back, always on the verge of vanishing. I told myself I could fix it, that if I loved her hard enough, she'd stay. But love doesn't work like that. Love isn't a leash. It's not supposed to be a rescue mission. Still, I kept trying. We had good days too. Days when the world felt small enough for just us. Days filled with sunlight and second chances. Days when she would fall asleep on my chest and whisper, "I'm scared of losing this." And I'd pretend not to hear the "this" she really meant. One afternoon, she left me a note. Not on the table, not in a book. On my pillow. "I'm sorry I can't be who you need." No signature, no goodbye, just that. I searched for her. Called every number. Visited every place we'd shared. Nothing. She had disappeared again. Only this time, I knew she wouldn't be back. I went back to the coffee shop, ordered her drink, and stared out the window. The rain was back. The sky just as gray. And in the quiet hum of everyday life, I realized something. Love had found me, and it had left. But it left behind a version of me that knew how to feel. Knew how to wait. Knew how to remember. That was the beginning. Or maybe just the first chapter of the story I never got to finish. I didn't stop going to the coffee shop. It became less about hope and more about ritual, like revisiting a dream I couldn't quite let go of. I told myself it was about closure, but the truth is I wasn't ready to let her memory dissolve into the rest of my past. Her absence sat across from me like a ghost that wouldn't leave, sipping imaginary coffee, flipping pages of a book I couldn't read anymore. Days bled into weeks, and people around me moved on. The barista started greeting me with a sympathetic nod, then stopped asking if she'd be joining me. I suppose they all assumed the story was over. But stories don't end just because the characters leave. They echo. They haunt. And some chapters write themselves long after the ink has dried. It was a Tuesday when I found her name again. Not Nora, but her full name. On a flyer pinned to the bookstore wall beneath a stack of event announcements. It wasn't a missing person report or a memorial. It was a name listed under a photography exhibit. Through Stillness, works by Nora L. Ferris. My fingers trembled. I tore the flyer from the board and stared at it like it might disappear. She had left pieces of herself behind. And I wanted to see them. The exhibit was in a small gallery downtown, wedged between a florist and a yoga studio. I arrived early and waited outside, heart clenching every time someone walked in. I didn't know if she'd be there, or if this was her final goodbye masked as art. The walls inside were pale and bare, except for her photographs. Dozens of them, each one silent and aching. Empty chairs, foggy windows, cracked sidewalks, shadowed corners of rooms, and people. But never their faces, just glimpses, a hand reaching, a silhouette through glass, a back turned to the lens. Every image was like a sentence she never said to me. Every frame a confession too delicate to voice. And then I saw it, near the end of the corridor. A photo of my table at the coffee shop, my notebook in the center, the spine slightly bent, a pen resting on the edge. I hadn't known she'd taken it, but there it was, proof that I had lived in her world, even if only briefly. Next to it, a plaque. The things we never say. That's when I knew she had heard me all along. Maybe not through words, but through the quiet we shared. She'd immortalized that silence, framed it, and now strangers stood before it, guessing at the story behind it. I felt seen and invisible at once. I stayed until closing. She didn't come. Or maybe she did, and I just missed her. Or maybe she stayed hidden, like always. The girl who built walls from silence and left keys in the form of photographs. That night I walked home under a sky thick with clouds. Every street lamp buzzed like a question I couldn't answer. Why did she run? What was she afraid of? Why did she let me in only to vanish again? I tried to let it go. I tried to date again. Other women, other smiles, other cups of coffee. But none of them carried that invisible weight she did. None of them knew how to disappear without leaving. I deleted her number, hid the notebook, Told myself I was ready to move on. But grief has strange rules. It lets go when it wants to, not when you ask it to. One day, I received a letter, handwritten. No return address, just my name. I recognized her handwriting before I even opened it. My heart thudded against my ribs like it was trying to break free. Inside was a single sheet. No greetings, no date, just a story. A confession, really. She wrote about a boy she loved once, before me. A boy who said he'd stay, and then didn't. She wrote about the hospital room where she waited for news that never came. About the guilt she carried for surviving something he didn't. She wrote about how she never fully came back from that. How every connection after felt like betrayal. How she saw me and wanted to try, but couldn't promise anything. You deserved someone who wasn't haunted, she wrote. But I kept showing up anyway. Because you made me forget, just for a while. And at the bottom, one line in shaky ink. I'm trying. Not for you, not for him. For me. I read it until the paper wore thin. Until her voice felt like it was echoing inside me. I didn't reply. I didn't know how. She hadn't given me an address or a way to find her. Maybe that was the point. Maybe some truths are meant to float between people like smoke. Visible, fleeting, impossible to hold. I started writing again. Real writing. Not just scattered thoughts in a notebook, but whole pages, stories, characters. I poured every piece of her into them, not to preserve her, but to set her free. And in doing so, I found pieces of myself that had been buried beneath the wanting. Months passed. The world kept spinning. Her photos stayed in the gallery, gaining quiet acclaim. I'd visit sometimes, standing in front of our table, wondering how many people saw it and thought it was just a chair and a book. How many never noticed the ghost of a story in the frame? I received another letter, this time a postcard. A seaside town, cliffs against a gray sky. No message, just a single line. The sea teaches you to stay and leave at the same time. No name, no return. But I knew. Her handwriting had softened, like she was healing, like she was letting the past breathe. That postcard sat on my windowsill for weeks. It became a reminder that healing doesn't follow a straight path. That sometimes love doesn't end. It changes form. I kept writing. Published my first short story, titled it Cares Without Names, that dedicated it to N. It wasn't much, but it was something. A way to say thank you to someone who taught me that silence can be louder than words. I think about her still, in fleeting moments, when the rain hits the glass just right, when I hear a song that feels like longing, when I see someone alone in a cafe with a book and a story behind their eyes. I don't know if I'll ever see her again. Maybe we were never meant to last. Maybe we're meant to intersect, leave traces, and move forward. But I carry her with me, in the pauses, in the photographs, in the things we never say. That's the strange thing about love. It doesn't always need an ending. Sometimes it just needs a witness. Someone to say, I saw you, and mean it. Weeks folded into seasons, and life, with its indifferent rhythm, pulled me forward. Work demanded more of my time, friends drifted in and out of my orbit, and the city changed around me like a living organism shedding skin. But inside, I remained tethered to something unfinished. I no longer waited for her in cafes or searched the faces of strangers for a glimpse of those eyes. But I still paused whenever I passed bookstores or saw photographs in gallery windows. Grief doesn't scream, it whispers through the cracks of your ordinary days. I learned to live with the H like background noise. Subtle, persistent, familiar. One afternoon in early spring, I stumbled across an open mic night flyer. It wasn't the kind of thing I normally paid attention to, but something about it tugged at me. Maybe it was the title scrawled across the top in bold black ink, unspoken words. I went, not because I expected anything, but because I couldn't not go. The venue was small and dimly lit, tucked between a thrift store and a bakery that smelled like burnt sugar. Inside, mismatched chairs and second-hand couches made the room feel more like someone's cluttered living room than a performance space. People read poems, played soft guitar melodies, told stories that bled with rawness. And then a woman stepped up to the mic. I knew it was her before she even spoke. The posture. The way she tucked her hair behind her ear. The pause before she took a breath. It was Nora. Her voice was lower than I remembered. Warmer. She didn't look around the room. She looked through it. Like she was searching for a memory. Not an audience, she began reading. Not a poem. A letter. Her voice cracked only once. I once told someone not to fall in love with me, she read. And he didn't listen. I'm glad he didn't. Because I didn't know, back then, how much I needed to be seen. The silence in the room was thick, reverent. I left. Not because I didn't care, but because I cared too much and didn't know how to handle it. I left because I thought broken people don't deserve whole love. But maybe we do. Maybe we especially do. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I felt like if I blinked, the moment would disappear again. I don't know where he is now. Maybe he's forgotten me. Maybe he remembers only the mess. But if he hears this, wherever he is, I hope he knows you were the first place I ever felt safe. She stepped away from the mic. Didn't look at anyone. Just walked back into the crowd like she hadn't shattered the air around her. I tried to follow her, but people closed in, bodies moving, clapping, speaking. By the time I reached the back of the room, she was gone again. I stood outside for a long time. The spring air was sharp with city noise and blooming lilacs. I wanted to chase after her, call her name, pull her back into my orbit. But I didn't, because something in her tone told me it wasn't time yet. Not quite. But maybe soon. I went home and started writing again. Not fiction this time. I wrote about us. About that first silent connection, the months of tangled longing, the absence that carved hollow spaces in me. I wrote without editing, without censoring. It was messy and raw and honest in a way I hadn't dared be before. And I mailed it. Not to her. I still didn't know where she lived, but to the open mic venue. I addressed it simply for the girl who read the letter. I didn't expect anything. I just needed to put the words somewhere outside of myself. A month passed. Then two. And then a letter, this time with a return address. She didn't write much, just a line. Some stories are meant to be paused, not ended. Let's talk. It wasn't poetic or cryptic. It was real. I stared at the handwriting for hours, rereading that line like it contained a secret code. We met in a park, the same park where we once walked past statues and forgot to speak because silence felt safer than words. She wore a red scarf I hadn't seen before. Her hair was longer again. There were more lines near her eyes, but they weren't just from sadness. She smiled first. I thought maybe you hated me, she said softly. I tried to, I replied, and that was enough. We walked. We didn't try to define what this was or wasn't. We didn't ask the questions that could ruin the fragile calm between us. We just existed, side by side, rediscovering the shape of each other through glances and half smiles. Over time, we rebuilt something. Not what we had before, something different. Older, wiser, less desperate, more careful. She still disappeared sometimes. Emotionally, I mean. Still had days where she wouldn't answer questions or seemed miles away even as I held her hand. But now, she told me when it was happening. She learned how to say, I'm struggling, instead of vanishing. And I learned how to wait, without pushing, without fixing. She invited me to another exhibit. Her photography had evolved, less loneliness, more light. Faces began to appear in the frames, children laughing, a couple holding hands, a self-portrait, half shadow, half sun, next to it, a plaque, becoming. I understood. We began building a quiet life. Coffee on the windowsill, books left half, read but shared. A photo of us in the hallway. Not posed, just a candid taken by a friend when we weren't looking. We never called it healing. That word felt too complete, too finished. But we were learning to live alongside the wounds. Then one day, she asked if she could show me something. We drove to a small coastal town 3 hours away. Parked near the cliffs. Walked in silence until we reached the edge. This is where I almost didn't make it, she said. I didn't need to ask what she meant. And this is where I started wanting to live again, she added. I turned to her. She was looking at the horizon, the wind playing with her scarf. "I didn't know who I was then," she said. "But I kept picturing someone who might stand beside me someday and not be afraid of the broken parts." I didn't speak. I just stepped closer. "And you did," she whispered. I kissed her then, not with urgency, but with reverence. The kind of kiss that seals a moment rather than tries to possess it. That night, we stayed in a small inn near the water. The waves echoed through the windows. She fell asleep with her head on my chest, and I didn't wonder if she'd disappear, because I finally understood. Some people don't stay in one place, but they can choose to return, again and again. Not all love stories are about forever. Some are about finding your way back, even if it takes years, even if the route is complicated. And sometimes, if you're lucky, they're about staying. Not because you have to, but because you choose to. We settled into something like peace, though it didn't resemble the fairy tale I once imagined love should be. It wasn't candlelit dinners or flawless conversations or waking up each morning with hearts swelling. It was dishes in the sink, unfinished thoughts, awkward silences that slowly became comfortable. It was knowing when to speak and when to simply stay. The romance was quiet but steady, like a river carving out new paths in old stone. The more I looked at her now, the more I understood that Nora had never been fragile. She had just been protecting a part of herself, so carefully that even she couldn't find it sometimes. And now, she was handing me the map, slowly, piece by piece. Her photography continued to gain attention. Small features in magazines turned into gallery interviews. Invitations began arriving from other cities. At first, she dismissed them, saying she wasn't ready to leave again. But I could see the itch in her eyes. The same way she used to look out windows toward something always slightly beyond her reach. I told her I wasn't afraid of distance. She said she was. That winter, she was offered a residency in Lisbon. 3 months. All expenses paid. A chance to capture the soul of a city through her lens. I saw the way her fingers tightened on the envelope, how her lips pressed into a hesitant line. "You should go," I said. "I don't want to leave you," she answered. And for the first time, I said the thing I had held back for too long. "But you need to go for you." We didn't make promises. We didn't talk about calling every night or pretending the space wouldn't change us. We acknowledged what it was, a beautiful unknown. The night before her flight, we stayed up until morning. No movies, no distractions. Just memories spilled out like threads. She told me about the first time she saw me in the cafe, how she almost walked back out. I told her about the day I got her postcard and read it while crying into cold coffee. And then, morning came. At the airport, we stood by the glass, watching her plane rest on the tarmac like a creature gathering strength. "I'm scared I'll become someone you don't recognize," she whispered. "Then we'll meet again," I said, "as new versions of us." She kissed me. Not as a goodbye, but as a bookmark. And then she was gone. I returned home alone, the apartment suddenly feeling too symmetrical, too quiet. At first, I tried to fill the space with sound. Music, audiobooks, open windows letting in the city noise. But eventually I allowed the silence to settle. In it I found strange comfort. I read more, wrote even more. And, without meaning to, I began documenting our story. Not just the parts I'd already lived, but the way her absence reshaped me. The things I learned by missing her. Every Sunday, she sent me a photo. 1. No captions, no explanations. A window with a sheer curtain billowing. A cobblestone alley washed in golden light. A boat floating in still water, untethered. Each image spoke in her language. I answered with a letter every Monday. Sometimes a memory, sometimes just the mundane, what I cooked, what line from a book stayed with me that week, what dream woke me up. It wasn't a conversation, not in the traditional sense. But it was enough. By the second month, she sent fewer photos. Weeks passed without any. My letters became less structured, more like reaching into the dark and hoping to find her hand again. I didn't ask if she was okay. I didn't push. I remembered the girl who once disappeared without warning, but this felt different. until one day a package arrived. A small wooden box sealed with red string. Inside was a single photo printed on thick matte paper. It was a self-portrait, not a mirror selfie or a posed shot. Just her, sitting at a window, light framing her face. And for the first time, she was looking directly into the lens. On the back, she'd written, "I'm ready to come home, if you'll have me." I stared at those words until the ink blurred. I didn't run to the airport. I didn't plan a dramatic reunion. I cleaned the apartment, changed the sheets, bought her favorite tea, and I waited. 3 days later, she walked through the door without knocking. Her bag dropped to the floor, her shoes still dusted with travel. She looked tired but clear-eyed, and she smiled like she was finally returning to something she chose, not fled from. We didn't speak right away. She stepped into the kitchen, opened the cupboard, found the tea, and started the kettle, like she never left. "Over tea?" she said. "I thought I'd come back broken again, but I think I came back whole." And I believed her. The next few weeks weren't a fairy tale. There were arguments, small necessary ones. She hated how I left shoes by the door. I couldn't sleep when she kept the light on too long reading. We learned each other again, like dancers returning to the same rhythm with slightly different steps. We traveled together, finally, short trips at first, a weekend by the lake, a visit to her hometown which she hadn't seen in years, and eventually Lisbon. She showed me the bench she'd sat on when she decided to come home, the bookstore where she bought a copy of the same novel she used to read in the cafe. Back in the city, she was offered a joint exhibit with another artist. This time, she didn't hesitate. She asked me to help with the curation. I spent hours arranging the images, listening to her explain which pieces hurt to hang and which ones felt like liberation. The night of the gallery opening, she pulled me aside and pointed to a photo I hadn't seen before. It was of me, writing in the notebook unaware. A moment I didn't know had been captured. "That was the day I decided to trust again," she whispered. I didn't know what to say. "I want people to see the parts of you I've carried with me," she added. "Because you saw the parts of me I didn't even know were worth loving." And in that moment, I realized something I had never quite understood before. Love doesn't always arrive with clarity. Sometimes it crawls in through the cracks and grows silently in the shadows. It doesn't always come with a promise or a plan, but when it's real, it keeps finding you. That night, we didn't talk about the future in broad strokes. No rings, no houses, no ticking clocks. We talked about next Tuesday, about cooking dinner together, about finally watching the movie we'd been meaning to. And somehow, that felt bigger than any vow. Because this time, it wasn't about what we could be. It was about what we already were. Two people who had gotten lost and found each other anyway. Two people still choosing each other, even on the days when it was hard, especially on those days. And in the corner of that gallery, surrounded by strangers staring at fragments of our journey, I kissed her. Not to claim her, not to impress anyone, but because sometimes love needs to be reminded that it's allowed to be seen. She smiled against my lips and whispered, "Thank you for waiting." And I whispered back, "Thank you for coming back." But what I didn't say, what I didn't need to, was that part of her had never really left. The seasons continued their quiet revolutions around us, and our life slowly took on the texture of something real. Not a fantasy stitched together by longing, not the fragile shell of recovery, but a day-to-day existence that held weight and light in equal measure. The honeymoon softness wore off, as it should, and beneath it we discovered the marrow of what we had built. Something raw, durable, and flowed in all the right ways. Nora was no longer the ghost of a memory. She was present, loud when she wanted to be, opinionated about things like how I stacked the dishes or which way the blinds should face. She laughed more now, openly, without the cautious glance that used to follow every joyful sound as if waiting for it to be stolen. And when she cried, she didn't apologize for it. That alone felt like a revolution. We moved apartments. Not for any dramatic reason, just because the old place was too full of echoes of beginnings that had already been written. Our new home was smaller, but brighter. Large windows, uneven floorboards, and a crooked balcony we filled with potted plants we pretended to know how to take care of. The neighbors were a retired couple with a loud dog and a college student who played guitar badly but earnestly. We grew accustomed to the noises of others' lives, letting them blend into the soundtrack of our own. I kept writing, not about us anymore, but from the calm that she helped me reach. My second short story collection got picked up by a small press, and at the launch event, she stood beside me, her hand clasped in mine like a quiet seal of pride. When I read an excerpt aloud, I noticed her mouthing the words. She had already memorized them. Her photography changed too. She started experimenting with color, layering, movement. Her latest project was a series on imperfection. Blurred motion, accidental double exposures, mismatched lighting. She titled it Stillness in the Chaos and told me, "It's not about controlling the shot anymore. It's about letting it breathe." We had our share of friction. Love doesn't cancel out the sharp edges. It just teaches you how not to cut each other with them. There were days when we retreated to opposite corners of the apartment, needing silence more than comfort. There were nights we fell asleep back to back, unresolved tension like a third presence between us. But we always found our way back. Over coffee or music, or a half sentence that broke the dam. One evening in early autumn, we sat on the balcony under a navy sky, string lights glowing like fireflies, the plants rustling in a tired breeze. She turned to me suddenly and said, "Do you ever think about kids?" It wasn't a question I expected. "I do," I admitted. "Sometimes." She nodded slowly, her gaze drifting into the dark. "I'm terrified I'll mess them up. That I'll pass on my silence." "You've already broken your silence," I said. "Maybe that's the most important thing to pass on." She didn't answer right away. Then she reached out and took my hand. "If we ever do, I want them to know that love isn't about being perfect. It's about staying. Showing up. Even when it's hard." The idea of a family became something soft between us. Not a demand, not a checkbox. Just a shared dream we kept on a high shelf, bringing it down to admire now and then. Not ready to use it, but not ready to forget it either. That winter, Nora's father passed away. She hadn't spoken to him in years. There had been something brittle in their relationship. Never discussed fully, just hinted at in stories about locked doors and distant voices. When the call came, she stared at the screen like it was a test she hadn't studied for. She didn't cry. Not immediately, not in the way I expected. She said, "I don't know what to feel." And I said, "You don't have to decide right now." And we flew to the funeral in a town that smelled like salt and old trees. The church was half empty. She stood at the back, hands clenched into fists, and didn't approach the casket. She didn't speak at the service. She just watched. That night in the hotel, she curled into herself on the bed and whispered, "He never saw who I became. You did that for you." I reminded her, "Not for him." She nodded. But I still wish he'd known." She wrote a letter the next morning and left it on his grave. I didn't ask what it said. I didn't need to know. Grief didn't change her. It revealed the parts of her still in flux. She began spending more time alone, walking the city with her camera, sitting in the park where we first reconnected. She said she needed to sort through the pieces, to find which ones were hers and which ones she'd been carrying for someone else. I gave her space, and she returned from it slowly, like someone surfacing from deep water. In the spring, she came home one day holding a stray cat. Mangy, cross-eyed, missing a chunk of its left ear. I found him in the alley. He followed me. "We can't keep him," I said automatically. "We're keeping him," she said, and we did. She named him Sunday. He scratched the couch, knocked over books, and slept curled between us like a tiny guardian. He was grumpy and needy and absolutely perfect. With Sunday came a quiet shift. We stopped saying if and started saying when we travel again. When we get that second bookshelf. When we grow old together. It was never dramatic. No big declarations. Just small promises hidden in the folds of everyday sentences. And one day, over pancakes and spilled syrup, she looked up from her sketchbook and said, "I think I want to marry you." I blinked. "You think?" She laughed. "No, I know. But I didn't want to say it with candles and violins. I wanted to say it here, with your hair messy and the cat judging us." I smiled. "Well, I know too. We didn't rush. We weren't that kind of couple. We took our time, planned a ceremony with 20 people and a lot of wildflowers in a greenhouse that smelled like spring rain. She wore a yellow dress. I wore my grandfather's watch. There were no vows, just a joint letter we read aloud, recounting the things we survived, the things we chose, the things we still hope to become. And when we kissed, it wasn't like in the movies, it was better, because we knew what came after, not just the good days, but the real ones. The ones with cracked mugs and missed trains and long, imperfect silences. And through all of them, we stayed. We didn't expect life to settle down just because we said vows in a greenhouse. Just because we promised forever in front of people who had seen us broken and reassembled. In fact, the years that followed brought more change than we ever could have scripted. But maybe that's what made it real. How the storms came and we didn't scatter, how we bent but didn't break. That's what marriage was for us. Not a destination, but a long, winding corridor with stained walls and sunlit corners and doors that led to places we didn't know we'd need. After the wedding, we returned to our quiet apartment with its uneven floorboards and cranky cat, and nothing felt different except for the fact that everything somehow did. She still made tea too strong. I still hogged the blankets. We still forgot whose turn it was to buy groceries. But there was a softness in the way we moved around each other now, an invisible thread that kept us close even when our backs were turned. Nora continued to take photos. Not for fame, not for gallery walls, but because it had become how she processed the world. Her lens was her way of listening. She began teaching photography at a small community center downtown, working with kids who didn't know how to talk about what they'd lost, but who learned to see the world differently through the frame of a camera. She called them the quiet ones, and she loved them fiercely. I published my third book, then a fourth. My words, once born from loneliness, began to feel like offerings instead of confessions. Readers would write and tell me how a line helped them breathe, how a character reminded them they weren't alone. And every time, I'd show the messages to Nora, and she'd smile like it hers too, because it was. One evening in late August, I found her on the floor of the hallway, staring at a shoebox full of letters she'd kept from before me, unsent, unspoken, unopened. When I knelt beside her, she whispered, "I want to burn them." So we did, in a small tin bucket on the balcony, one by one, watching the past curl and disappear into the stars. She didn't say what was in them, and I didn't ask. Not everything needs to be translated into words. We spent anniversaries quietly, sometimes forgetting the date and celebrating a week late. Once, we celebrated with pancakes and old movies because we were both too tired to go out. Another time, we drove 6 hours to a mountain town just because she wanted to wake up somewhere unfamiliar. We danced once in the rain, soaked and laughing, holding a broken umbrella between us like a flag of surrender. We weren't trying to impress anyone. We were just trying to remember what it meant to feel alive together. And then came the year everything cracked. It started with headaches. Hers, subtle at first, the kind you dismiss. Then the light sensitivity, the dizziness, the confusion. She dropped a cup one morning and just stared at the pieces, not understanding how they got there. I saw her slipping away in inches, and each inch felt like a mile. She resisted doctors, said she didn't want to know, said some truths were heavier than silence, but I couldn't watch her fade. The diagnosis came like a slow-motion accident, a tumor. Inoperable. Manageable, they said for now. We didn't cry at first. We just sat there, side by side, staring at the sterile room like it was another gallery. Except this one displayed outcomes instead of art. She went quiet again, the way she had in the beginning, before we knew how to break each other open gently. I tried to talk. She pretended to listen. But I could feel her retreating, and I was terrified. Of losing her, yes, but more than that, of her leaving before she was physically gone. Then one night, she came to bed late, crawled in clothes, and whispered, "I'm scared of dying," with words left inside me. So we began writing together. Each morning, she would write a sentence on a slip of paper and leave it on the kitchen table. I would answer it. One day she wrote, "What is the one thing you've never told me?" And I wrote back, "Sometimes I still look for you in crowds, like I did when you vanished." As she began documenting the process, not just with photos, but with audio, with scribbled journal entries, with interviews she made me conduct at random hours. "Ask me anything," she'd say at 2 a.m. "What's your earliest memory of me? What's your favorite scar? What will you do when I'm gone?" I answered every question, and she recorded every answer. When her strength began to fade, she asked me to take her back to the coffee shop where we met. It had changed. New owners, new colors, new faces, but the table was still there. We sat in silence. She rested her head on my shoulder, and I could feel her breathing shallow and slow. "Do you think anyone knows this is where it all began?" she murmured. "No," I said. "But we do." In her last month, she asked for 3 things. First, to finish her exhibit. She had titled it "Fragments of Stillness," a collection of images taken during treatment. Unflinching, raw, beautiful in their unfiltered truth. The gallery showed them all, every single one. People wept, people stared, people saw her. Second, she wanted me to write our story, beginning to end, no softening of the truth. "Don't make me a martyr," she said. "Make me human." And third, she asked me to keep Sunday. "He's grumpy like me," she smiled weakly. "You'll need that." The last night we had together, she didn't say goodbye. She just squeezed my hand and said, "You gave me a home I didn't think I deserved." And I told her, "You taught me what love sounds like when no one is speaking." After she was gone, I didn't know how to breathe. The apartment felt like an echo. I spent days walking in circles, picking up her camera, setting it down again. Sunday meowed at the door for hours. Her absence wasn't quiet. It roared, but I wrote. I finished the book. I didn't make her a tragedy. I made her a symphony. And the final chapter ended with a photo. One I took myself, of her favorite chair, an empty cup beside it, a sliver of sun on the cushion, and the caption, "The echo of always." Years have passed now. I visit the gallery every November, when the light is the same as the day we met. Her exhibit still hangs in the back room. People come, people go. But sometimes I see someone stop. Really stop. Look at the photo of the cafe table. And I wonder if they hear what I hear. The soft beginning of a story. The quiet age of love that changed everything. I don't tell them. Some things are meant to be discovered, not explained. Love doesn't always end with a kiss or a ring or a final breath. Sometimes it ends with a sentence. Sometimes with silence. And sometimes, if you're lucky, it never really ends at all. Enjoyed the video? Give it a thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, and tap the bell so you never miss an update.